You guys are all here today, and because we'll be discussing what is SolarPunk. What does SolarPunk mean? First, hello, a brief introduction if you're new here. My name is Crystal. I'm the founder of GroupHug Solar. A few bullet points of my background. I'm an industrial designer. I want to give a quick shout out to Emma, who's also on the call, who is weeks away from graduating from college. Very exciting. And Emma's our design and community intern. I'm also a teacher of design and interaction design at the School of Visual Arts, NGIT, and Parsons. I actually used to be the director of product at a tech toy company called Little Bits, and I quit most of that to focus on solar. So a little bit about GroupHug before we get into what is SolarPunk. At GroupHug, we like to say that we make ridiculously good-looking solar panels. Like I mentioned, I used to design tech toys and toys for STEAM and engineering education, things like synth guitars, Avengers toys. The coolest was probably a remote control DIY R2D2. And then I sort of woke up one day and was like, I don't really enjoy what I'm doing. I want to do something different. And I'm so frustrated by climate change and everything that's happening. What can I actually do? So that day I was like, oh, I know, I'll go out and get a solar panel. Like, how hard could that really be? But actually, I don't live in a house. I live in an apartment. So what can people who live in apartments and maybe don't have all of those means do to get their foot wet in solar? And there are personal solar panels on the market, but I think one of the things that frustrated me is that, like, I'm not a very outdoorsy person. I wouldn't buy any of these camping solar panels, and I really wanted to find something that was more personal, more decorative, and could be integrated into my everyday life, which is actually a theme of SolarPunk, which we'll talk about. So I always love showing this picture to anyone who comes to our webinars or workshops, because this is the first commercially available solar panel by Bell Labs, 1954. And I always sort of laugh when I show this because it's been, about 70 years since this came out, and solar panels really almost look exactly the same, which is very disappointing. So at GroupHug, we really believe that the future of energy needs creativity and not just utility. So these are a couple pictures from our company's process, prototyping solar panels in different shapes and sizes. This is like a solar necklace, a herringbone solar panel. These are early sketches of product iterations that we were going through. And then finally, we launched in 2019 on Kickstarter with this product, a window solar charger, and it's a solar panel designed to be hung in your window. There's a built-in battery and USB port where you can charge USB devices anytime. And we really like to say that this is your first step into solar. It could be your introduction of how you start using it every day. Some pictures of pets always sitting by the window. So some pictures of it in the wild. You might have heard of us because we were on Shark Tank last year and got a deal with Mark Cuban. So we're working with Mark Cuban to grow the company right now. And I'll end here. I don't want to talk about GroupHug too much, but I'll end here because it's a nice transition into SolarPunk. That one of the things we've really been focused on is approaching solar panels with a more creative lens. And that solar panels don't have to be rectangles. They could be in so many different shapes and sizes and configurations. And this is a like functional solar, I hesitate to call it a sculpture. I guess it is a sculpture, but it's a functioning solar panel called Solar Cat. And it's a 140-watt solar panel hanging in the window at the New York Hall of Science in Queens. One of the best pieces of feedback we've gotten about Solar Cat is that people will, it's designed to be an exhibit to teach people about solar panels. And some people will walk by and say, where's the solar panel? And you're like, oh, it's right there. It's just in the shape of a cat. And I think that type of integration where you don't even think about the solar panels is really powerful. Okay, so with that, what is SolarPunk? So the first thing I'll say is that When we say the word punk, it doesn't, we'll talk about this, it doesn't necessarily mean punk music, but I'm sure some of you might have heard of these other sort of punk movements in art and literature, like steampunk, cyberpunk, and now solarpunk. And I'll talk about those in more detail. Like I said, punk doesn't necessarily mean punk rock music. The punk part really means rebelling against like societal norms of standards we have, sort of conceptions about what society and how people should operate, how the government operates, how architecture operates. So it's more of like a rebellious spirit and kind of bucking the status quo, but it doesn't actually have anything to do with music, which I think is a common misconception. So we talked about other punk movements that I just want to talk about briefly because I think they're really predecessors to solar punk. And I actually want to keep the chat open in case I miss anything, but has anyone heard of steampunk, or is anyone like a big fan of steampunk? I think it's probably the most recognizable of the punks. From what I read in my research, it really stems from like the 60s and 70s, like incorporating technology and aesthetic inspired designs by the 19th century. And it really centers around steam powered machinery. I think what's so interesting about these punk movements is it tends to be a dichotomy. So, here is a young woman who's like part human, part like steam powered machinery and gears, which it's sort of like an old way to approach robotics in this like really interesting old and new style. And with steampunk, you might actually see like steam powered machinery and gadgets and artwork kind of drawn in a Western theme, which is sort of tongue in cheek because in Western times they didn't have steam powered like plants and stuff like that. A couple examples, just in case you've never heard of steampunk before. I had to put another R2D2. It tends to be again like almost Western or Victorian. You can see like the top hat and the embroidered vest. A lot of brass and wood and natural materials and metals and things like that. I think this is like the coolest R2D2. It's like he's made out of a barrel and there's all of these gold embellishments. I think gears, like a lot of gears is really common in steampunk too. Because this isn't a steampunk talk, if you're really interested in steampunk, there's so many resources about it online. Definitely go check it out. The other punk wave, cyberpunk, and I think a lot of people have seen this, but maybe didn't know it was called cyberpunk. That's how I felt when I was doing the research. So cyberpunk was more popular in like the 1970s and 1980s. And I think the big difference with cyberpunk is it features more advanced technologies like AI is a big one, AI, robotics, automation, sort of big brother-esque theme, sort of like the Terminator. And it's juxtaposed with a more like gritty, low-tech environment. So I'll keep going, but I'll show some examples where if anyone here is a big fan of like Blade Runner or Philip K. Dick novels, which I am very much in here, where you can see like a bustling city that's extremely high tech, but then at the same time, there's a lot of sort of low tech aspects about it. So I sort of think of like, I guess the Terminator's a little debatable. I think it is a little bit. Blade Runner's a really clear example. And even what's that movie with Bruce Willis? The Fifth Element. Fifth Element is another one that you can think of too. But if Emma, I actually feel like this aesthetic is like suddenly really popular in design schools, like vaporwave.
It definitely is.
It is, right? Why is that?
I don't know. I feel like you can even see it in furniture and stuff too. Like it goes into everything.
Yeah, I think this one, even though it's been around for decades, I feel like it's really having a moment right now with like the neon vaporwave. If you're interested in this aesthetic, you can also Google vaporwave, like VAPOR wave. When I taught a design class last year, and I had like 2 or 3 students that like every project they made was like so cyberpunk. I was like, wow, this is like, yeah, it's interesting how these waves come along. Okay, so now you guys know about steampunk, cyberpunk, solarpunk. So solarpunk is much more recent than those other punk movements. When I was reading about it, it seems like the earliest most popular examples are from the early 2000s. And some people debate that SolarPunk is actually just sort of another part of another type of cyberpunk. But based on all of the examples I saw, I actually feel like there's a really clear distinction. So what's unique about SolarPunk is that the idea of SolarPunk really rejects this like dystopian pessimism and puts forward images of this is so cheesy, but like hope and renewable powered futures that challenge us to alter our social habits and trajectory. And we'll get really deep on this and show more examples. So this is a quote from Elvia Wilk, who writes for the eFlux Journal, which I'll put a link for you guys because she's written a lot about it. SolarPunk is a literary movement, a hashtag, a flag, and a statement of intent about the future we hope to create. So it's that feeling of hope. In terms of iconography that you would see in SolarPunk, so when we saw steampunk examples like gears, monocles, brass details, wooden details are all sort of classics for steampunk. I think for cyberpunk, like the color palette being neon, like actual neon signs, like futuristic cars, things like that. For SolarPunk, you'll see solar panels, you'll see wind power, wind turbines in these landscapes. You'll see vans, so sort of smaller, simple living vans, waterfalls, vertical gardens. I think gardening and produce is really well explored in SolarPunk and more, which you guys will see animals. The one thing that I wanted to paint is sort of sorry, I don't know if you guys can hear that. My neighbor is screaming right now. The one thing that I'll say is, when I was reading about SolarPunk, and I think why I find it so fascinating and inspiring is that it's this moment of hope and, I think we all feel the pressures of climate anxiety and climate change and feeling like there's so little we can do as individuals. And I think what SolarPunk does is it says, all of those sort of examples of this like apocalyptic dystopian doom, like let's not emphasize though. Let's emphasize what could happen if everything went right. If we if we designed our built environment where it was more harmonious with nature, if we actually invested in renewable energy, if everybody was living in the way that they wanted to live. And that's what it says. I pulled this picture of WALL-E, which I'm sure most people have seen by now, because I think WALL-E, that sort of dystopian garbage world that WALL-E paints, is sort of the opposite of SolarPunk. It's saying like that future of WALL-E is that we did everything wrong and we had to move to a different planet. And I just love this as an example because it's really like these decrepit buildings, and like it's such a struggle to even find a plant. If you guys have seen WALL-E, it's really the opposite that we're doing. And this is just another picture of, whenever you think about like climate change and like the future of climate change, you probably think about images like this. And SolarPunk is really this optimistic movement that's trying to change that imagery. And I think just before we go into a couple examples of artists doing SolarPunk work, it's a lot like, science fiction doesn't have to be super depressing. I love reading science fiction, and I think sometimes it is kind of tough because it always is like, it's 2080 and there's 10 people living on Earth because all of these bad apocalyptic things happened, and sort of science fiction doesn't have to be like that, and SolarPunk paints this like different future of it. So a couple examples, and I actually want to pause and we'll talk about some of the elements that we're seeing here. Jessica Pearlstein is an artist and also a writer, and I will show you guys the book that she wrote later. But if you look at this illustration, there's a lot of things happening. So you can see wind turbines in the background. There's the geodesic dome here. There are solar panels. It's sort of like a dense, it looks like a dense urban environment, but there's also so much nature and natural growth happening. There's hummingbirds here. You can see this. I haven't read the book yet. You can see the character here who's like, enjoying this flower on her balcony, but there's also a lot of like high tech things happening, but there's a lot of low tech, like farm meets city happening. So it's this interesting clash of these different worlds. And you guys should feel free to write in the chat too if any of these images calls out to you and you have a question, or there's a part of it you really love. Like, I would love to live in this world wherever this person is. I think it's so fascinating and beautiful. Here is another piece. This is by someone named, I'm not going to pronounce it right, but Muna Sichi. I think his alias is also called Imperial Boy, if you want to Google Imperial Boy. But I think this is another example of an urban environment that's also growing with nature. You can see trees integrated in with the buildings. One thing I didn't add when I was talking about iconography is that sometimes SolarPunk aesthetic actually looks sort of Art Nouveau, which is a different time period in architecture. It's sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, what it reminds me of is like some architecture in Lord of the Rings, actually. It's like very decorative and with a lot of details and arches and things like that. The one thing I want to note on this Imperial Boy piece is that unless you, I'm actually not sure, if you look really closely, you might see a solar panel or a wind turbine. I actually don't see any right now, but the term solar punk does not mean that solar panels will be in every piece. It's really more about the larger movement of, this sort of high-tech renewable sort of utopia that could happen. Yeah, and it's sort of like, if you think about steampunk, like there's not steam in every picture, it's like more of the movement. So it's sort of characterizing, that solar panels exist in this world. They're not in every picture. But I really, really like this one too. I think what appeals to me about
this scene is beautiful. I want to live.
It's so beautiful. Yeah. What appeals to me about these two is I think we think about like cities versus agriculture a lot, or cities versus farms. Like, if you want to be around nature, you can't live in the city, and vice versa. And what I love about these is it's really imagining them together, which is nice. Oh, here's another one. I wrote Imperial Boy on this one. I'm pretty sure it's the same artist, but I think this one's really beautiful too, and shows the layers of trees with, like, designed with the buildings. And yeah, if you are interested in this type of work from after the workshop, I would definitely look up this artist, Imperial Boy, because he seems to be one of the more well-known ones working in the movement. This is the last example I had, and one of my favorites. I actually could not find the artist's name. It wasn't credited on the website I saw, but I think what's so interesting about this one is it's sort of reimagining what the inside of a building could look like. So a lot of those other ones were showing landscapes of cities, and what's interesting about this one is that, well, first of all, if you look closely up here, I'm pretty sure I'm interpreting it a little bit, but I see solar panels on the roof. There's like a special type of bifacial solar panel where the light passes through them. So solar panels on the roof, the inside of the building being a park, I think is really, really, really interesting. Even the shadows on here are really interesting. There was actually a park in New York City. I don't know what happened to it. That was called the Low Line. I'm sure some of you guys have heard of the High Line, which is a park that was built on these old railroad tracks. They were building a low line, which was a park that was being built like underground, which I think if they fully realized it would actually look kind of like this. So, solar punk future doesn't have to be that far away. A couple books that I want to point out in case people are interested. This first one is the picture that I showed you with the solar panels and wind turbines and the woman smelling a flower. It's called The Fifth Sacred Thing, and I honestly am going to order one right after this. It looks really, really interesting. There's another book called Ecotopia. It is in Japanese, but from my research, it was cited as being one of the top works with a lot of solar punk in it. And then the last one looks like the last one looks really interesting as well. And I'm gonna show you guys some links where you can do your own research and figure out what's the best for you. But you can already, the illustration of the cover looks amazing, but it's called Sun Vault Stories of Solarpunk and Eco Speculation. That looks really amazing. And then two resources that I want to throw out there in case people want to research this more and figure out how to get more into it. I can email you these links. I know it's a little tough to get off of a slide, but this sci-fi books.com had a list of the best Solarpunk books, and I think they included comics too. So I think comics and graphic novels lend themselves really well to these genres. And then there is actually a Solarpunk festival that I found. I don't know if they had one this year, but I'm definitely interested in figuring out how to attend and get more involved. This was sort of a short one, so I would love to have more of a discussion. Let me stop sharing my screen. One, put it on gallery mode. I think one reason why I am super taken in by Solarpunk is, I think, part of what I love, and obviously why I started GroupHug, is because I really envision solar panels being in like every shape, size, and color, in a way integrated into your home and your life in a way that you don't even know that it's a solar panel. Like, this is very crooked, but I'm just sitting at home and I just have a solar panel right here. And I think, it doesn't have to be done in the most traditional way. There's so many ways to integrate it. And I think it's sort of a great sign of success to me if you look at one of these Solarpunk landscapes and it's in this utopia and the solar panels aren't, the most obvious thing in the picture, because I don't think they